Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. Let me quickly remind you that Charlie Fabian is ready and willing to take whatever suggestions, ideas, documents you might want to send our way to help us plan future programs. You can reach him at charlie.info438@gmail.com. I want also to take a moment to tease you a bit. We have finished a new book. It's called Understanding Capitalism. It is, if you like, a kind of final piece of a trilogy. We've already produced Understanding Marxism and Understanding Socialism, which many of you have kindly ordered. So this is Understanding Capitalism. It's a completion of that three-part project, but it is also a culmination of 12 years of doing this program every week, plus 40 years before that of teaching economics at half a dozen universities. I think you'll find it an extraordinary summary and compilation of capitalism's problems, the myths that support it, the crisis it now faces, and what comes afterwards in a way that is readable, accessible, and above all, interesting. Look for it. It's coming soon. Okay, today's program is devoted to socialism's old and new. As capitalism's crisis deepens, as the interest in socialism spreads around the world more and more, it's time to understand how socialism has changed, how it is evolving. It doesn't stand still any more than anything else ever did or does. So it's important, even though unfortunately still rare in the United States, to keep up with its evolution, with its change. So let's do a brief exploration of socialism's old and new. First, where did the socialism come from? Well, socialism is a product of capitalism. You might say, as I often do, that it's the shadow. Capitalism never loses its shadow. It never can. That's what shadows are. Okay, capitalism all along the way, from the beginning, produced people who loved it and celebrated it, on the one hand, still do, and people who don't like it, criticize it, feel victimized by it, and still do. And that's not unique to capitalism. That's been true of slavery, feudalism, ancient village economies, you name it. Human beings are complicated and different. They like and dislike, in varying ways, all of the institutions they have ever produced and those that they have ever decided to go beyond. Slavery, for example, both in its U.S. forms before the Civil War and elsewhere in the world, always produced people who liked it and celebrated it and people who felt victimized and who were critical. Remember, here in the United States, there were critics of slavery who wanted slaves to be better treated, fed better, clothed better, sheltered better, allowed to keep their families intact, and so on. And then there were the critics of slavery who said, no, wait a minute. The name of the game isn't to improve the position of a slave. It's to abolish slavery. It's to abolish the very possibility for one human being to own another. Well, capitalism very similarly has produced people who like it and celebrate it, but also feel victimized and criticize it. And over time, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, socialism became the single most important tradition of people who were critical of capitalism. And that's why we're talking about it today. It is the single most important, widely developed, widely spread in every country on this earth. There are socialist parties and socialist magazines and socialist candidates, and you name it, including the United States. So it's the dominant tradition, not the only one, but the major one, the biggest one, the one that has developed its arguments the furthest. Okay, this old socialism, not surprisingly, included people who wanted to make the conditions of workers, employees in capitalism, better. You know, like those folks who wanted to make the conditions of slaves better. They want workers better paid, a higher minimum wage, better benefits, a health program, a pension, and so forth. They want to improve the conditions of workers within capitalism. They're critical of how capitalism treats employees. They want them treated better, and they're committed to doing that. Interesting. Then there are others, also calling themselves socialists, who go much further. They don't want workers just improved. They don't want their conditions bettered. They want the abolition of capitalism. For them, the first group of socialists are basically advocating capitalism with a human face, they often say. A softer, gentler, kindler capitalism. They want a New Deal for the working class, as Franklin Roosevelt's government called it. But then there were the others back in Roosevelt's day and today who say, no, socialism has a much bigger objective. It's the abolition of capitalism. Just like those critics of slavery went further and said, we are abolitionists. We all know what happened in the end when Abraham Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation and actually put it into effect in the years thereafter, more or less. That proclamation said slavery is abolished. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution said slavery was abolished, except in prisons, the famous except. So socialists could be understood, on the one hand, as the people who want to improve the conditions of employees within capitalism, and those who want to abolish capitalism. And I want to talk to you about those two, because those are the two branches, if you like, of old socialism. And together, in their tension, they produced a new socialism that I'll get to later. Let's follow first those socialists who wanted to improve the conditions of the working class. Here we go. The most famous of them have been the socialists who made the following determination. The best way to improve the condition of working people inside capitalism is if we use the fact that the employees are much more numerous than the employers, that the employees are the majority in modern society. We can use that fact to win elections, especially if elections are organized as one person, one vote. We can use the majority that the employees constitute to win elections and thereby take over the government, which is what you get if you win an election. And then we can have the government make the conditions of working people better. Give them public education, subsidize public housing, provide a national health insurance program. I could go on, but you all know what I'm talking about. Because there have been efforts by socialists, among others, to get the government to do these things for the mass of employees for the last century or more. The New Deal of Roosevelt was famous for that. But so have all kinds of other governments, Republican and Democrat alike in the United States, been either pressured or forced or begged to take steps to improve the conditions of employees, of working people. That kind of socialism is in fact alive and well because there are lots of people around the world right now, including across the United States, working very hard in countless ways, inside and outside the Republican and Democratic parties, to do that. It's become part of modern life. And the people who fight for it will often call themselves socialists, but often they won't. And for my purposes, it doesn't much matter. What does matter is to understand that there's a part of the socialist movement committed to that idea of what the task of socialists is. But as I told you, it's complicated. There's another group of people, and particularly starting in the 20th century, the last one, who agreed that the task is to get the government to improve the conditions of working people, but who disagreed with the first group of socialists because they didn't think voting and elections would ever really get the job done. Here was their argument, and here it still is. The capitalist system has long ago learned how to use politicians, the mass media, schools, universities, to persuade and manipulate people so that they don't vote in their own economic self-interest. They get distracted by issues of all kinds other than the capitalist system that they live in. And so if we socialists want to capture the government, as we think we should, we're not going to be able to do it with elections and voting. The capitalists have the big media. The capitalists own the government. The capitalists shape the colleges, schools, and universities. We have to make a revolution. We have to take up armed struggles. And in 1917, a group of socialists, believing that, made a revolution in Russia, overthrew the capitalist government, and established what they called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After the break, we'll come back and look at both of those old socialisms and how they produced a new one. Stay with me. We'll be right back. If presentations like this strike you as worthwhile, as of course I hope they do, please understand, I'm sure you know, they cost money. And we have no choice, since we're not going to be funded by big corporations for all the obvious reasons. We have no choice but to ask you to pitch in and help in whatever way you can. Please understand that's what we rely on, and that's why we will be enormously appreciative of whatever you can contribute. Thank you. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. Our program today is devoted to the old and the new socialism. Before the break, we had ended up with the Soviet Revolution in Russia in 1917. We presented it as an example when socialists who agreed with their fellow socialists that the government was the way to get the conditions of working people improved, but they didn't agree on how to do it. Instead of elections and political parties and parliaments and all of that, the Russian revolutionaries, led by Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, made a revolution with armed struggle, took over the government, fought a civil war, won the civil war, and established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they did something socialists had not before done. They went beyond the government regulating, controlling, influencing private enterprises, private capitalist enterprises, which is all that socialists before had done. They went beyond and said, no, we're going to have this government that we took over in a revolutionary way also become the owner and operator of industrial enterprises, basically factories, and to some extent offices and stores. We don't trust the private capitalist owner-operators. If we're going to take care of the mass of people as our top priority, we cannot leave the ownership and operation of industrial enterprises in private capitalist hands, because they will run them to make a private profit, not to serve the working class, and we'll make sure that happens. And so in the Soviet Union, over the 70 years of its existence, industries, and eventually much of agriculture too, were organized in enterprises owned and operated by the government. Indeed, many people came to believe, not quite correctly, that socialism is that, ownership and operation by the government. But that's not correct. Socialism before the Russian Revolution was about the government passing laws and regulations about people's working conditions, not taking over enterprises. There were socialists who wanted that, but they didn't prevail. And then in the 20th century, really only in the Soviet Union, in the first half of the 20th century, that was the only place where that kind of old socialism, government-focused, that's what made it old. That's only in Russia that it prevailed. So we had, from 1917 until around 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had two kinds of old socialism. I call them two kinds of old socialism because they were agreed that the government was the key thing. Capture the government, one way or another, and get it to improve the conditions of working people in the factories and the offices and the stores. One old group did it by parties and elections, and the other old group did it by revolutions. Then, at the very middle of the 20th century, the Chinese socialists followed the Russian socialists by making it a revolutionary seizure of the state in China in 1949. But these are still and were old socialisms because they agreed capture the state, make the state powerful, either as the lawgiver and regulator or else as the owner-operator of the state. Now, why do I call something new socialism? Because the old socialisms, the kind that just wanted the state to regulate and legally intervene. And by the way, examples, Scandinavia, Western Europe, many other parts of the world are governed by socialist parties committed to that old socialism. Spain today, technically the leader of Germany, Olaf Scholz, is that kind of a socialist. Bernie Sanders advocates that kind of socialism. And we also have the Soviet kind, not anymore in the Soviet Union, that reverted back to Russia, but certainly in the People's Republic of China. But even there, it's a kind of a mixture of both kinds of old socialism. In the People's Republic of China, half the economy is government-owned and operated enterprises, and the other half is the government overseeing private capitalist enterprises, but with the government saying you have to treat workers this way, this way, this way, wages have to be here, housing has to be provided. You have the two old socialisms in a kind of hybrid form in China. Now, here comes the important point. Socialists of all kinds struggled very hard across the 19th and 20th century to establish all of these old kinds of socialism in many parts of the world. And they succeeded. And they succeeded. And they are succeeding to this day. But they also produced an important self-criticism among socialists. And the criticism took two parts. Number one, we have over-focused ourselves, overemphasized the government. The government cannot and should not be the crucial agency that brings socialism as the better system beyond capitalism. Partly because the government cannot, by itself, do that. So we're asking of government something more than it can do. And number two, if we give the government more and more power, hoping it will use it to move us from capitalism to socialism, we run the danger, which we have seen and lived through, that a powerful government can do many things other than make a transition from capitalism to socialism. And many of those other things we don't like and we don't want and we are not in favor of. There were and have been and continue to be socialist criticisms of powerful government. Wow. What did these self-criticisms lead to? Well, it may surprise you if you haven't followed the development of socialism. And for those of you that are in my U.S. audience, you have not been allowed, by the way culture is shaped in this country, to know much or hear much or participate much in socialism's evolution. But a new socialism has emerged. Like all the old socialism, it takes its cues from things that happened centuries ago. The new socialism says the government can't do everything, and the government shouldn't be empowered to try to do everything. In fact, governments have gone in the wrong direction, in large part because we socialists have not paid attention to other equally, if not more important, locations in modern capitalism that have to be changed. It's not just the government. It's not just the relationship between private enterprise and state enterprise, the extent and forms of government intervention. It's not just those things. The new socialism says we have neglected what goes on inside the enterprise, whether or not it's owned and operated by a private citizen under government regulation or by the government. We socialists need to, because by not having changed the capitalist way of organizing enterprises, we have left capitalism to undermine, to pervert, to retard socialism's development. And what do they mean? They mean simply this. Capitalism inherited from slavery and feudalism a highly unequal, undemocratic way of organizing enterprises. In all of this, all three systems, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, a tiny group of people, masters, lords, employers, own and control the livelihoods of the mass of people, slaves, serfs, employees. That, these new socialists say, is the problem. That is what capitalism didn't overcome when it got rid of slavery and feudalism. And that is what the old socialisms did not overcome when they gave the state its new role, its new power, its new position in society. We have to rectify that. The focus of new socialism is therefore on the enterprise, reorganizing it, and in a particular way, by democratizing the enterprise, by converting it, changing it from a top-down hierarchy, employers, a small number, call the shots, run the operation, hire and fire everybody else, and then the mass of people, the workers who actually make it happen, who have little power, little control, sit at the bottom. That's got to be changed. The enterprise has to be democratized. It has to become a community of equals, run democratically, not hierarchically. If socialists do that, they can give the working people at the base of society the institutional power to make sure government does what socialists want it to do and does not do what socialists have learned it must not do. It's a radical new socialism for the 21st century, focused on the transformation of the workplace first, and the role of the government versus the private sector a distant second. Don't think socialism is what your parents or grandparents may have told you. Like everything else, it has changed. There are two socialisms, old and new, and the one we will be living with in the months and years ahead is more and more the new one. Thank you for your attention as always, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.